The moving truck wheezed like an old man catching his breath, groaning one final time, before sputtering to a halt in front of 847 Rosewood Drive. Ethan Carter leaned forward from the driver's seat of his aging pickup, eyes narrowing at the weathered facade of the house. It looked tired, like him, but still standing, still waiting. "Is this it, Dad?" Emma's voice piped up from the passenger seat, her face barely visible behind the worn paperback she clutched tight. "It doesn't look very happy." Ethan glanced at her, then back at the house. Paint peeling from the shutters, a crooked mailbox, shingles flaking off the roof like old scabs. He smiled faintly. "It just needs someone to love it," he said. And maybe, just maybe, that someone could be them. Rosewood Acres was the kind of suburban neighborhood that hadn't changed its haircut in 20 years. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Neat lawns, white fences, cars parked nose-in like soldiers at rest. But beneath the uniformity, Ethan had heard rumors. Strict HOA, nosy neighbors, passive-aggressive newsletters. Still, it was affordable, in a good school district, and quiet. Something he and Emma hadn't had much of since Sarah died. He stepped out, his boots crunching on gravel, and began unloading a few bags. Emma wandered to the edge of the yard, kneeling to examine a patch of dandelions poking through a crack in the sidewalk. A black SUV rolled to a smooth stop across the street. The window slid down, revealing a thin-lipped woman with blonde hair, tied in a bun so tight it seemed to pull at her temples. "You must be Mr. Carter," she said, not unkindly, but with the clipped efficiency of someone who laminated her grocery lists. "I am, and this is my daughter, Emma." The woman barely glanced at Emma. "Patricia Langston, I'm the current chair of the Rosewood Acres HOA. We've been expecting you." She consulted a tablet with practiced precision. "Please remember that yard modifications, including lawn ornaments and exterior changes, must be pre-approved. Contractors must use the front access road only. No heavy vehicles through residential streets. We've had issues in the past." Ethan opened his mouth, closed it again. "Noted." As the SUV purred away, Emma tugged at his sleeve. "Is she the boss of something?" "Something like that," he murmured. He didn't unpack much that night. The air inside the house smelled like dust and old wood, but there was a strength in its bones. Ethan liked that. He made up a mattress on the floor for Emma, then took the couch for himself. They ate grilled cheese on paper plates with lemonade in plastic cups. As night fell, Ethan stepped outside to clear his head. The street was quiet, porch lights casting yellow pools on the sidewalk. Most houses looked the same. Tidy, unremarkable, safe. It was what he'd wanted, what Emma needed. A place where she could heal, where they both could. But something nagged at him. The way Patricia had spoken, like she was reading from a script. The way the neighbors he'd glimpsed had hurried inside when they saw him, like they were afraid of something. He shook his head. Paranoia. Sarah's death had left him suspicious of everything, seeing threats where there were only people trying to live their lives. He needed to give this place a chance. Give Emma a chance. The next morning brought the first test. Ethan woke to find a folded paper tucked under his windshield wiper. Official letterhead, Rosewood Acres Homeowners Association. The message was brief but pointed. "Dear Mr. Carter, welcome to our community. Please be advised that the following violations have been noted on your property. Unapproved lawn decoration, dandelions in sidewalk crack. Non-compliant mailbox positioning. Unauthorized vehicle parking, pickup truck in driveway overnight. These items require immediate attention. Failure to comply may result in fines. Regards, Patricia Langston, HOA Chair." Ethan read it twice, then crumpled it in his fist. Emma appeared beside him, still in her pajamas. "What's that?" "Nothing important." He forced a smile. "How about pancakes for breakfast?" But as they ate, the paper's words echoed in his mind. Dandelions were a violation? His truck couldn't stay in his own driveway? What kind of place had he brought his daughter to? Over the next few days, more notices appeared. The gutters needed cleaning. The grass was a half-inch too long. A small tool shed he'd begun assembling was non-compliant with community standards. Each notice came with the same threat: comply or face fines. Emma watched him grow quieter, more tense. She'd seen this before. the way his jaw tightened when he felt trapped, the way his hands clenched and unclenched. It had happened a lot in the months after her mother's funeral, when the bills piled up and the job offers dried up. "Dad," she said one evening as he stared at another notice, "why don't you just tell them to back off?" Ethan looked at her, surprised by the steel in her voice. At 15, Emma had her mother's sharp eyes and sharper tongue, but she'd been quiet since the move, lost in her books and her grief. "It's not that simple, Em. We're new here. We need to what? Let them walk all over us?" She crossed her arms. "Mom wouldn't have put up with this." The words hit harder than any HOA notice. Sarah would have marched over to Patricia's house and given her a piece of her mind. Sarah had never been afraid of a fight, especially when it came to protecting her family. But Sarah was gone, and Ethan was tired. Tired of fighting, tired of losing, tired of disappointing the people he loved most. "Sometimes," he said quietly, "you have to choose your battles." Emma's eyes flashed. "And sometimes you have to fight back." That night, after Emma had gone to bed, Ethan sat on the porch with a beer and tried to make sense of it all. The house was good, solid, with potential. Emma's school seemed decent, and the neighborhood was safe. But the HOA's grip felt suffocating, like living under a microscope. He thought about Sarah, about the way she'd faced down her cancer with the same fierce determination she'd brought to everything else. She'd fought until the very end, never backing down, never giving up. What would she think of him now, hiding behind excuses, letting bureaucrats push them around? A light flickered across the street. Mrs. Henderson from 3 houses down was walking her dog, a small terrier that yapped at shadows. She saw him and waved tentatively. Ethan waved back, and for a moment, her face brightened. Maybe there were allies here. Maybe not everyone was afraid of Patricia Langston and her rules. As he headed inside, Ethan made a decision. Tomorrow he'd start asking questions, not about compliance or regulations, but about the people who lived here, the community beneath the HOA's iron fist. If he was going to make this work, for Emma, for himself, for Sarah's memory, he needed to understand what he was really up against. The fight was coming whether he wanted it or not. The only question was whether he'd be ready for it. The official letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, crisp and white against the weathered wood of Ethan's mailbox. His name typed in formal block letters, the HOA seal pressed into the paper like a brand of ownership. Emma found it first, holding it up as he returned from his morning run. "Looks important," she said, but her voice carried a note of dread they both recognized. Ethan tore it open, his coffee growing cold in his other hand. The words seemed to blur together at first, then snapped into sharp, threatening focus. "Notice of violations and pending fines property, 847 Rosewood Drive, owner Ethan Carter. The following violations have been documented on your property. 1. Unpermitted storage structure, tool shed, -$150 fine. 2. Non-compliant landscaping, overgrown dandelions, -$75 fine. 3. Unauthorized vehicle storage, pickup truck, -$100 fine daily until resolved. 4. Mailbox positioning violation, -$50 fine. Total current fines, $375 payment due within 30 days. Failure to comply will result in additional penalties and potential legal action." Emma read over his shoulder, her breath sharp against his neck. $375? For what? Ethan crumpled the letter, then smoothed it out again. The number stared back at him, merciless and precise. $375 they didn't have, for crimes he didn't understand. "The truck fine is daily," Emma said, pointing to the line. "That's $100 every day we live here." The math hit him like a punch to the gut. In a month, they'd owe thousands. Money he didn't have, for a home they'd barely begun to settle into. That afternoon, Ethan walked the neighborhood, trying to see it through the HOA's eyes. Every lawn was exactly the same height, every mailbox positioned at the same precise angle. The houses looked like catalog photos, perfect, sterile, empty of personality. No children's bikes and driveways, no garden gnomes or wind chimes, or any sign that real people lived here. It was like walking through a museum exhibit, Suburban Life, circa 1995. He stopped at Ray Thompson's house 2 streets over. Ray was in his 70s, a quiet man with calloused hands and watchful eyes. Ethan had met him briefly at the mailbox cluster, and something about the old man's careful politeness had stuck with him. Ray was kneeling in his front garden, tending to a small patch of vegetables that looked somehow defiant among the regulation grass. "Afternoon," Ethan called. Ray looked up, glanced around the street, then nodded. "Mr. Carter, settling in?" "Trying to. Mind if I ask you something?" Another glance, this one more nervous. "Suppose not." "How long have you lived here?" 15 years, come October." "And the HOA? Has it always been like this?" Ray's hand stilled on a tomato plant. For a long moment, the only sound was the distant hum of lawnmowers and air conditioners. Then Ray stood, brushing dirt from his knees. "Used to be different," he said quietly. "Used to be neighbors looking out for neighbors. Then Patricia took over the board. Oh, must be 8 years now. Things changed." "Changed how?" Ray walked closer, lowering his voice. "Rules got stricter, fines got higher, people got scared." He paused, seemed to weigh his words. "Lost a lot of good folks, moved away rather than fight. And the ones who stayed? Learned to keep their heads down." Ethan felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. "What about you? Why didn't you leave?" Ray's smile was sad and stubborn at the same time. "This is my home. Been here too long to run now." He nodded toward the vegetable patch. "Besides, someone's got to keep a little life in this place." That evening, Ethan called the HOA office. Patricia answered on the second ring, her voice professionally pleasant. "Mr. Carter, I trust you received our correspondence." "I did. I have some questions about these fines." "Of course. I'm happy to clarify our community standards." "My truck. I park it in my own driveway. How is that a violation?" Rosewood Acres maintains strict aesthetic guidelines. Commercial vehicles and pickup trucks are considered unsightly and must be parked in enclosed garages only. "I don't have a garage." "That's unfortunate, but not the HOA's concern. The covenants are quite clear." Ethan felt his temper rising. "And the tool shed, it's 6 feet by 4 feet. Barely bigger than a doghouse. All structures require pre-approval, no exceptions." Her tone remained infuriatingly calm. "Mr. Carter, I understand this may seem overwhelming, but these rules exist to protect everyone's property values. Surely you want your investment protected? What I want is to live in my own home without being nickel and dimed for breathing." A pause. When Patricia spoke again, her voice had cooled by several degrees. "Ontus, Mr. Carter, I suggest you familiarize yourself with the community covenants you agreed to when you purchased your property. Ignorance is not a defense. The fines stand." The line went dead. Emma found him an hour later, sitting at the kitchen table with papers spread around him like a war zone. Property deeds, HOA bylaws, community covenants, documents thick with legal language and obscure regulations. "Find anything useful?" she asked, sliding into the chair across from him. "Mostly lawyers trying to sound important." He rubbed his eyes. "According to this, the HOA can fine us for pretty much anything. Grass too long, grass too short, wrong color mailbox, unauthorized pets." "Unauthorized pets?" "Dogs over 50 pounds require a permit. Cats are limited to 2 per household. No rabbits, ferrets, or birds." Emma shook her head in disgust. "This is insane, Dad. How is any of this legal?" "Because we agreed to it when we bought the house, apparently." He gestured at the mountain of paperwork. "Somewhere in here, I signed away our right to live like normal human beings." "So what do we do?" The question hung between them, heavy with implications. They could pay the fines, try to comply, hope to fade into the background like everyone else. They could pack up and leave, start over somewhere else with even less money and even fewer options. Or they could fight. Ethan looked at his daughter, saw Sarah's fire burning in her eyes, and felt something shift inside him. A door he'd kept carefully closed since the funeral creaking open, letting in light he'd forgotten existed. "We learn the rules," he said finally. "All of them. Every single regulation, every clause, every loophole. If they want to play games, we'll learn how to play better." Emma's smile was sharp and approving. "Now you're talking." That night, after Emma had gone to bed, Ethan sat on the porch again. But this time, he wasn't hiding. He was watching, learning. Counting the houses with violations the HOA somehow missed, noting which neighbors walked their dogs after dark, which ones kept their curtains drawn tight. A pattern emerged. The houses closest to Patricia's were pristine, perfect, untouchable. The ones farther away bore small signs of resistance. A wind chime here, a garden gnome there, tiny acts of rebellion hidden in plain sight. His phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "Saw you talking to Ray today. Be careful, they're watching." A friend. Ethan looked around the empty street, feeling eyes he couldn't see, cameras he couldn't find. The suburban paradise suddenly felt more like a prison, with Patricia Langston as the warden and the HOA as her guards. But prisons had weaknesses, rules had loopholes, wardens made mistakes. And Ethan Carter was done being afraid. The attic smelled like dust and forgotten time, thick with the ghosts of previous owners. Ethan climbed the creaking ladder with a flashlight clutched between his teeth, searching for the source of the leak that had started dripping into Emma's room after last night's storm. He'd been putting off this exploration for weeks, but the HOA's latest notice, a $50 fine for unauthorized roof staining caused by the leak, had finally forced his hand. If he was going to fix their problems, he might as well start with the literal ones. The flashlight beams swept across boxes and forgotten furniture, casting dancing shadows on the slanted walls. Most of it was junk, left by the previous owners. Christmas decorations from the 80s, boxes of musty clothing, a bicycle with flat tires and rust eating through the spokes. But in the far corner, tucked behind a stack of moldering encyclopedias, Ethan found something different. A metal filing cabinet, gray and official-looking, with a small brass plate that read, "R.A. Development, Property Records." The top drawer was locked, but the key hung from a piece of string tied to the handle. Inside, manila folders thick with documents stretched back decades. Deeds, surveys, development plans, correspondence between builders and city officials. Ethan pulled out a folder labeled Original Plat, Rosewood Acres 1987 and spread the contents across the dusty floor. What he found made him forget all about the leak. The original development plan showed Rosewood Acres as he'd never seen it. Not just the houses, but everything. The streets, the sidewalks, the small park at the center of the neighborhood. Even the retention pond that bordered the eastern edge. All of it belonged to a single entity, Rosewood Development, LLC. But what caught his attention was a handwritten note stapled to the corner of the main plat map. Full property transfer to final purchaser upon completion of development, see Attachment 4B. Attachment 4B was a legal document dense with whereas clauses and heretofore declarations, but the essential meaning was clear. When Rosewood Development finished building the neighborhood, they would transfer ownership of all common areas, streets, sidewalks, park, pond, to the final homeowner to close on their property. Ethan checked the date on his own deed, then cross-referenced it with a list of sale dates tucked into another folder. His heart hammered against his ribs as the truth sank in. He was the final purchaser, the last house sold, which meant, "Emma," he called, his voice cracking with excitement and disbelief. "Emma, get up here." She appeared at the top of the ladder minutes later, still in her pajamas, hair sticking up in defiant cowlicks. "Dad? It's Saturday morning. This better be good." "Look at this." He thrust the documents at her, his hands shaking slightly. "Look at what I found." Emma studied the papers, her expression shifting from sleepy annoyance to sharp attention. She'd always been good with details, better at reading the fine print than he was. "Wait," she said slowly, It says I own the streets. The sidewalks, the park, everything that isn't someone's actual house. Including the retention pond where Patricia holds the annual HOA picnic. Including that." They stared at each other in the dusty attic light, the magnitude of the discovery settling between them like a bomb with a very long fuse. "Dad," Emma said carefully, "do you know what this means?" Before he could answer, the doorbell rang. They looked at each other, then Emma crept to the small attic window and peered down. "It's Bill Turner," she whispered. Bill was the retired groundskeeper Ray had mentioned, a cantankerous old man who'd worked for the HOA for 20 years before they'd forced him out. Ethan had been meaning to talk to him, but Bill kept odd hours and seemed to avoid his neighbors. They climbed down from the attic and Ethan opened the front door. Bill stood on the porch, wearing stained work clothes and a skeptical expression. "Heard you've been asking questions," Bill said without preamble. "Some. Heard you got yourself a pile of fines from Queen Patricia." Ethan nodded. "That's one way to put it." Bill grunted. "Mind if I come in? Got some things you might want to know." They sat around the kitchen table, Bill accepting a cup of coffee with the grudging air of a man who didn't often accept hospitality. Emma hovered nearby, listening. 23 years I worked for this HOA, Bill began. Started when old Pete Rosewood was still running things, back when it was actually about taking care of the neighborhood. Patricia showed up about 10 years ago, got herself elected to the board, then slowly pushed everyone else out. Emma had wanted to come, but he'd convinced her to stay home. This first confrontation needed to be between him and Patricia, adult to adult, with no distractions. Besides, if things went badly, he didn't want his daughter to see him fail. The board members filtered in one by one, 5 people who looked like they'd been ordered from the same catalog. Patricia entered last, her heels clicking against the linoleum with the precision of a metronome. She wore a navy blazer and carried herself like a general inspecting troops. "Mr. Carter," she said, settling into her chair at the head of the table, "I must say, I'm surprised to see you here. Most residents prefer to handle violations through correspondence. Most residents don't have what I have." Patricia's smile was thin and practiced. "And what exactly do you think you have?" Ethan opened the folder and spread the documents across the table. The original plat maps, the development agreements, the transfer deed that made him owner of everything Patricia claimed to control. The papers rustled in the artificial air conditioning, but otherwise, the room was silent. Patricia's composure cracked for just a moment, a slight widening of her eyes, a pause in her breathing. Then the mask slid back into place, professional and unmoved. "Mr. Carter, I'm not sure what you think these documents prove, but they prove I own the streets, the sidewalks, the park where you hold your annual picnic, the retention pond, every inch of common area in this neighborhood." Ethan's voice was steady, but his hands trembled slightly. "Which means every fine you've issued for violations on my property is illegal. Every fee you've collected for maintaining areas you don't control is fraud." The other board members shifted uncomfortably, exchanging glances like guilty children caught in a lie, but Patricia remained still, her fingers steepled on the table. "These are very old documents, Mr. Carter. Property law is complex. I'm sure if you consulted with a qualified attorney." "I have." The lie came easily, born of desperation and the memory of Bill Turner's confident assertion that the documents were bulletproof. "Everything's legitimate, everything's legal. And everything changes now." Patricia leaned back in her chair, studying him with the cold calculation of a chess master. "What exactly are you proposing?" "I'm proposing you drop all fines against my property. Immediately. And I'm proposing this board start operating within its actual authority, instead of pretending to own things it doesn't." "And if we refuse?" Ethan met her gaze, thinking of Emma's fierce pride, of Ray Thompson's hidden garden, of all the neighbors who'd learned to keep their heads down and their voices quiet. "Then I exercise my rights as the actual owner of the common areas. I change the locks on the park gates. I block access to the retention pond. I charge the HOA rent for every board meeting held in the community center that sits on my land." The threat hung in the air like smoke. Patricia's smile never wavered, but something predatory flickered behind her eyes. "Mr. Carter, you seem to be under the impression that property ownership gives you unlimited power. But this is a community, governed by covenants and bylaws that protect everyone's interests. Even if your documents are authentic, and I'm not conceding that they are, the HOA has operated in good faith for decades. Any attempt to disrupt that could be seen as problematic." "Problematic how?" "Legal challenges can be expensive, time-consuming, destructive to families." Her gaze drifted toward the window, toward the direction of his house. "I'd hate to see a single father and his daughter get caught up in something so messy." The threat was velvet-wrapped but unmistakable. Ethan felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. This was exactly what Bill had warned him about. Patricia fought dirty, and she'd just made clear that Emma was not off limits. "Is that a threat, Ms. Langston?" It's a reality check, Mr. Carter. You're new here. You don't understand how things work, how delicate the balance is. Push too hard, too fast, and you might find yourself very unhappy with the consequences. Ethan gathered his documents, his hands steadier now that the battle lines were drawn. I understand perfectly. You've been stealing from this neighborhood for years, and now you're threatening my family to keep me quiet. I'm trying to help you avoid a costly mistake. The only mistake was thinking I could reason with you. He stood, tucking the folder under his arm. You have 48 hours to drop the fines. After that, things get interesting. Patricia's laugh was like breaking glass. Mr. Carter, you have no idea what you're up against. This isn't some corporate job where you can just bulldoze your way through obstacles. This is a community, with rules and relationships built over decades. You can't just storm in and tear everything down. Watch me. He left them sitting in their sterile room, but he could feel Patricia's eyes following him all the way to the door. As he walked home through the perfectly manicured streets, Ethan realized he'd just declared war on the most powerful person in Rosewood Acres. Emma was waiting on the porch when he arrived, her legs curled under her, a book forgotten in her lap. How did it go? About as well as expected. He sat beside her, suddenly exhausted. Patricia's not backing down. If anything, I think I made her angrier. Good. Mom always said you were at your best when you were angry. The comment hit him sideways, a reminder of Sarah's faith in his ability to fight when it mattered. Emma was watching him with the same intensity her mother used to bring to difficult conversations. Things might get complicated. Patricia made it pretty clear she's willing to play dirty. Then we play dirtier. You don't understand. I understand perfectly. Emma's voice carried an edge he'd rarely heard before. She's a bully, and the only way to deal with bullies is to hit back harder than they hit you. That night, after Emma had gone to bed, Ethan found himself back on the porch, but this time he wasn't alone. Ray Thompson emerged from the shadows like a ghost, moving with the careful deliberation of someone who'd learned to avoid attention. Heard you had a meeting with the board, Ray said, settling into the other porch chair without invitation. News travels fast. Janet Kowalski's grandson works maintenance at the community center. Said you had some kind of documents that got Patricia all worked up. Ethan studied the old man's face in the dim light. You interested in knowing what kind of documents? Might be, depending on what they say. So Ethan told him about the attic discovery, about the property transfers, about the legal reality that made Patricia's entire power structure a house of cards. Ray listened without interruption, his weathered hands folded in his lap. Son of a bitch, Ray said finally. All these years, and she's been running a con game. The question is, what do we do about it? Ray was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the sleeping neighborhood. You know what this place used to be like? Before Patricia, Bill mentioned it was different. Different doesn't cover it. Used to be block parties every summer. Kids running through sprinklers, neighbors helping neighbors. People cared about each other, not just their property values. What changed? Fear. Patricia convinced everyone that rules were the only thing standing between civilization and chaos. Said property values would plummet if we didn't maintain standards. One by one, people started keeping to themselves, stopped taking risks, stopped caring about anything but staying out of trouble. Ray turned to look at him directly. But if what you're saying is true, if you really own what you think you own, then maybe it's time to remind people what this place could be again. You make it sound simple. Simple doesn't mean easy. Ray stood to leave, then paused. Patricia's gonna come at you hard now. You ready for that? Ethan thought about Emma's fierce determination, about the documents hidden in his attic, about the choice between safety and justice that seemed to define every important moment of his life. I'm getting there. As Ray disappeared back into the shadows, Ethan remained on the porch, watching the dark windows of his sleeping neighborhood. Somewhere behind those walls were people who'd learned to accept less than they deserved, who'd traded freedom for the illusion of peace. Tomorrow, he'd start showing them there was another way. The anonymous note appeared under Ethan's door sometime before dawn, printed on plain paper in block letters that screamed paranoia. Patricia knows about your documents. Lawyers coming. Be careful. A friend. Ethan crumpled the paper, then smoothed it out again, staring at the words as if they might rearrange themselves into something less ominous. 48 hours hadn't passed since his ultimatum, but apparently Patricia wasn't waiting for his deadline. Emma found him in the kitchen an hour later, surrounded by coffee cups and legal documents he'd been rereading obsessively since 5 a.m. "Dad, you look terrible." "Thanks. Just what every father wants to hear." She poured herself orange juice and studied the papers scattered across the table. "These are the same documents you show the HOA board, right? The ones that prove you own everything?" "Yeah, but owning something and being able to prove it in court aren't necessarily the same thing." "What do you mean?" Ethan rubbed his eyes, feeling older than his 42 years. "Patricia's bringing in lawyers. Real ones, probably. And lawyers cost money we don't have. Even if we're completely right, even if these documents are bulletproof, fighting a legal battle could bankrupt us. So we find another way." "No, listen." She sat across from him, her expression serious in a way that reminded him painfully of Sarah. "You're thinking like this is just about us, about our house, our problems. But it's not. It's about everyone in this neighborhood, everyone Patricia's been ripping off for years. What's your point?" "My point is that we're not fighting this alone. Or we don't have to be." That afternoon they made their first real attempt at neighborhood diplomacy. Linda and Sam Hargrove lived 4 houses down in a tidy colonial with a small garden that somehow managed to look both beautiful and regulation compliant. Sam answered the door with the cautious politeness of someone who'd learned not to trust unexpected visitors. "Mr. Carter, Emma, what can we do for you? We were wondering if we could talk to you and Linda for a few minutes about the HOA." Sam's expression immediately grew guarded. "Is there a problem?" "That depends on how you look at it." Linda appeared behind her husband, a woman in her 50s with graying hair and laugh lines that suggested she hadn't always been this careful. "Sam, invite them in. We can at least hear what they have to say." The Hargrove living room was comfortable and lived in, with family photos covering the mantel and books stacked on every available surface. Linda served coffee in real cups while Sam remained standing, clearly uncomfortable with the whole situation. "We've been living here for 21 years, Linda began once everyone was settled. "We've seen a lot of changes, not all of them good." "What kind of changes?" Emma asked. "Used to be more neighborly," Sam said reluctantly. "Block parties, potluck dinners, kids playing in the streets. Now everyone keeps to themselves." "Because of the HOA?" Linda and Sam exchanged a look that spoke of years of careful conversations and unspoken agreements. "The HOA serves a purpose," Linda said diplomatically. "Property values, community standards." 27 violations in 3 months, Sam interrupted, his voice tight with suppressed anger. 27. For things like having our newspaper delivered to the wrong side of the driveway and hanging a bird feeder that was supposedly the wrong color. "Sam?" "No, Linda, I'm tired of pretending this is normal," he turned to Ethan. "You want to know about changes?" 5 years ago, the Kowalskis got fined for putting up a swing set without pre-approval. It was for their grandkid who was visiting for the summer. A swing set, for crying out loud. What happened? They fought it. Went to 3 different board meetings, filed appeals, hired a lawyer, cost them $4,000 in legal fees plus the original fine. For a swing set they ended up removing anyway. Emma leaned forward. "But that's insane. How can they fine people for normal family stuff?" "Because we signed agreements when we bought our houses," Linda said sadly. "Covenants that give the HOA broad authority to regulate community standards." "But what if those covenants aren't as legally binding as everyone thinks?" Ethan asked carefully. The room went quiet. Sam sat down heavily, his eyes sharp with sudden interest. "What do you mean?" So Ethan told them. About the documents in his attic. About the property transfers that had never been properly executed. About the legal reality that made Patricia's authority questionable at best. Linda's coffee grew cold as she listened, her expression shifting from skepticism to amazement to something that might have been hope. "You're saying Patricia doesn't actually have the right to fine us for violations on common property?" "I'm saying the common property isn't the HOA's to regulate, it's mine, and I didn't give them permission to act as enforcers." Sam laughed, a sound with no humor in it. 21 years. 21 years of keeping our heads down, following rules, paying fines for imaginary violations. And you're telling us it was all based on a lie? I'm telling you what the documents say. Whether that holds up in court is another question. Court? Linda's voice went small. This would mean lawsuits, wouldn't it? Legal battles? Not necessarily. If enough people know the truth, if enough people stop cooperating with Patricia's system, she might not have any choice but to back down. And if she doesn't? Ethan met her gaze honestly. Then things get complicated. They left the Hargroves with promises to think about it and be in touch. But Ethan could see the seeds of doubt and possibility taking root. Change was scary, but so was living under someone else's thumb indefinitely. Their next stop was Janet Janie Wells, a high school senior Emma had met at the bus stop. Janie lived with her grandmother in a small ranch house at the edge of the neighborhood, and her reaction to their story was immediate and explosive. "Are you kidding me? Patricia has been running a scam this whole time?" "Keep your voice down," Emma said, glancing around the teenage messy bedroom they were sitting in. "We don't know who might be listening." "Who cares? This is huge. Do you know how many kids have had to move away because their families couldn't afford the fines? How many families have been torn apart by this stupid system?" Janie was 17, with purple streaks in her brown hair and the righteous fury that only comes with youth and a clear sense of injustice. She'd grown up in Rosewood Acres, watched it transform from a real community into what she called a prison with good landscaping. "What can we do?" she asked, pacing around the small room like a caged animal. "How do we fight back?" "Carefully," Ethan said. "Patricia's already threatening legal action. If we move too fast, too obviously, she'll find ways to hurt people before we can protect them. So we start small. Grassroots." Janie's eyes lit up with the kind of dangerous enthusiasm that had probably gotten her into trouble at school. "I know kids whose families have been screwed over by the HOA, kids who are pissed off and ready to do something about it." "Janie, no, this is perfect. Adults are scared of lawsuits and property values and all that crap. But kids? Kids just care about what's right and what's wrong. And this is definitely wrong." That evening, as they walked home through the perfectly manicured streets, Emma was quiet in a way that meant she was thinking hard about something. "You know what's weird?" she said finally. "What?" Everyone we talked to had the same story. They all knew the HOA was out of control. They all had examples of ridiculous fines and stupid rules, but nobody ever thought to fight back. Why do you think that is? Ethan considered the question as they passed house after house, with drawn curtains and empty driveways. Fear, mostly, and isolation. Patricia spent years convincing people they're alone, that everyone else is fine with the system, that speaking up will just make them a target. But they're not alone. No, they're not. So what happens when they figure that out? Ethan looked at his daughter, saw the same fierce intelligence that had made Sarah such a formidable opponent in any argument, and felt something shift inside him. The fear was still there, but it was joined by something else, something that felt dangerously like hope. I guess we're about to find out. Bill Turner's garage was a museum of neighborhood secrets, decades of carefully preserved evidence, stacked in boxes and filing cabinets that looked like they'd been rescued from the set of a 1970s detective show. The air smelled of motor oil and old paper, with the faint mustiness that comes from keeping important things hidden for too long. "Been saving this stuff for 15 years, Bill said, pulling down a cardboard box labeled HOA Financial Records 2010 to 2015. "Always figured someday someone would need it." Ethan helped him clear space on a workbench covered with automotive tools and coffee-stained paperwork. Emma perched on a paint bucket, her phone ready to take pictures of anything that looked important. The afternoon light filtering through the grimy window gave everything a sepia tone, like they were uncovering history instead of fraud. "What exactly are we looking for?" Emma asked. "Proof," Bill said grimly. "Patricia's been cooking the books for years, but she's smart about it. Never takes enough to trigger an audit, never leaves obvious evidence. But patterns are harder to hide than individual transactions." The first box contained budget reports and board meeting minutes from Patricia's early years as chairwoman. On the surface, everything looked professionally managed. Neat columns of numbers, properly formatted documents, board approvals for every expenditure. But Bill knew where to look. "See this?" He pointed to a line item in the 2011 budget. "Community Beautification Fund, $15,000. Sounds legitimate, right?" Ethan squinted at the document. "What's wrong with it?" "Nothing, if there'd actually been any community beautification. But I was groundskeeper that year. The only landscaping work done was the regular maintenance, which was already covered under a separate contract. So where did the money go? Same place it always goes, Patricia's consulting company. Emma looked up from her phone. Patricia has a consulting company? Bill's laugh was bitter. Langston Property Solutions specializes in HOA management and community development. Amazing how often the Rosewood Acres HOA needs their services. Over the next 2 hours, they uncovered a pattern that was both breathtakingly bold and carefully constructed. Patricia had created a web of shell companies and consulting agreements that funneled HOA money into her personal accounts. A tree removal service that never removed any trees. A community survey company that never conducted any surveys. A legal consultation firm that charged thousands for advice that could have been found in any property law textbook. This is embezzlement, Emma said, photographing a particularly damning invoice. Straight-up theft. It's more than that, Ethan said, studying a spreadsheet that showed 5 years of suspicious transactions. It's systematic fraud. She's not just stealing money, she's stealing from the community. Bill pulled down another box, this one labeled Resident Files Confidential. Inside were manila folders for every household in Rosewood Acres, each containing violation notices, correspondence, and what looked like personal notes. Patricia keeps files on everyone, Bill explained, not just property violations, personal stuff, financial problems, family issues, anything she can use as leverage. Ethan opened the folder labeled Thompson Ray and found pages of handwritten notes detailing Ray's wife's cancer treatment, his grandson's learning disability, even speculation about his financial situation based on observations of his spending habits. This is sick, Emma said, reading over his shoulder. She's like some kind of suburban spy. Worse than that, she uses this information to target people. You think it's a coincidence that Ray's violation notices always come right before his wife's medical appointments? Or that the Kowalskis got hit with their biggest fine the week after Tom Kowalski lost his job? The evidence painted a picture of systematic psychological warfare, with Patricia using the HOA's authority to punish anyone who might pose a threat to her control. She'd identified the most vulnerable residents, elderly people on fixed incomes, families dealing with medical crises, single parents struggling to make ends meet, and applied pressure precisely when they were least able to resist. Hey, Ethan stood at the front. A table beside him stacked with document boxes and poster boards displaying copies of the most damning evidence they'd uncovered. His hands were steady, but his heart hammered against his ribs like it was trying to escape. Emma sat in the front row, her phone ready to record everything. Behind her, Ray Thompson nodded encouragingly, while Bill Turner lurked near the back exit like a sentry. Patricia arrived precisely at 7 p.m., flanked by 2 men in expensive suits who screamed "lawyer" from their perfectly polished shoes to their identical briefcases. She surveyed the packed room with the cool assessment of a general studying a battlefield, her expression revealing nothing. "Ladies and gentlemen," Ethan began, his voice carrying clearly in the suddenly quiet room, "thank you for coming. I know this is unusual, calling a meeting like this, but what I have to share with you tonight affects every single household in Rosewood Acres." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Patricia remained silent, but one of her lawyers was already taking notes. 3 weeks ago, I found documents in my attic that changed everything I thought I knew about this neighborhood. Documents that reveal the truth about who actually owns what, who has the authority to do what, and who's been lying to us for years. He gestured to the first poster board, which displayed a blown-up copy of the original property transfer document. According to the legal records filed with the county, I own all the common areas in Rosewood Acres, the streets, the sidewalks, the park, the retention pond. Everything that isn't someone's individual house lot belongs to me, not to the HOA. The murmur became a buzz of confused and excited voices. Patricia's lawyer leaned over to whisper something in her ear, but she waved him away, her attention focused entirely on Ethan. "Now, I know what you're thinking," Ethan continued. "So what? What does that mean for the rest of us?" "Well, it means that every fine the HOA has issued for violations on common property has been illegal. It means every fee collected for maintaining areas they don't control has been fraud. And it means the authority this board has been using to intimidate and exploit our community is based on a lie." Linda Hargrove stood up in the middle of the room. "Are you saying our violation notices aren't legitimate?" "I'm saying the HOA doesn't have the legal authority to issue them. At least not for anything involving common areas." "What about our property covenants?" someone called from the back. "Your individual property covenants are still valid, but those covenants don't give the HOA ownership of the streets or the right to regulate access to common areas. They certainly don't give the HOA the right to charge residents for maintaining property they don't control." Patricia finally stood, her voice cutting through the growing excitement like a blade. "Mr. Carter, this is all very interesting, but property law is complex. A few old documents don't overturn decades of established practice and legal precedent." "You're right," Ethan said. "Property law is complex, which is why I've had these documents reviewed by a qualified attorney." Another lie, but delivered with enough confidence to sound convincing. "Everything I'm telling you tonight has been verified." One of Patricia's lawyers started to stand, but she put a hand on his arm, stopping him. Smart. Any objection now would look like an admission of guilt. Ethan stood at the front, a table beside him stacked with document boxes and poster boards displaying copies of the most damning evidence they'd uncovered. His hands were steady, but his heart hammered against his ribs like it was trying to escape. Emma sat in the front row, her phone ready to record everything. Behind her, Ray Thompson nodded encouragingly, while Bill Turner lurked near the back exit like a sentry. Patricia arrived precisely at 7 p.m., flanked by two men in expensive suits who screamed "lawyer" from their perfectly polished shoes to their identical briefcases. She surveyed the packed room with the cool assessment of a general studying a battlefield, her expression revealing nothing. "Ladies and gentlemen," Ethan began, his voice carrying clearly in the suddenly quiet room, "thank you for coming. I know this is unusual, calling a meeting like this, but what I have to share with you tonight affects every single household in Rosewood Acres." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Patricia remained silent, but one of her lawyers was already taking notes. 3 weeks ago, I found documents in my attic that changed everything I thought I knew about this neighborhood. Documents that reveal the truth about who actually owns what, who has the authority to do what, and who's been lying to us for years." He gestured to the first poster board, which displayed a blown-up copy of the original property transfer document. "According to the legal records filed with the county, I own all the common areas in Rosewood Acres, the streets, the sidewalks, the park, the retention pond. Everything that isn't someone's individual house lot belongs to me, not to the HOA." The murmur became a buzz of confused and excited voices. Patricia's lawyer leaned over to whisper something in her ear, but she waved him away, her attention focused entirely on Ethan. "Now, I know what you're thinking," Ethan continued. "So what? What does that mean for the rest of us?" "Well, it means that every fine the HOA has issued for violations on common property has been illegal. It means every fee collected for maintaining areas they don't control has been fraud. And it means the authority this board has been using to intimidate and exploit our community is based on a lie." Linda Hargrove stood up in the middle of the room. "Are you saying our violation notices aren't legitimate?" "I'm saying the HOA doesn't have the legal authority to issue them. At least not for anything involving common areas." "What about our property covenants?" someone called from the back. "Your individual property covenants are still valid, but those covenants don't give the HOA ownership of the streets or the right to regulate access to common areas. They certainly don't give the HOA the right to charge residents for maintaining property they don't control." Patricia finally stood, her voice cutting through the growing excitement like a blade. "Mr. Carter, this is all very interesting, but property law is complex. A few old documents don't overturn decades of established practice and legal precedent." "You're right," Ethan said. "Property law is complex, which is why I've had these documents reviewed by a qualified attorney." Another lie, but delivered with enough confidence to sound convincing. "Everything I'm telling you tonight has been verified." One of Patricia's lawyers started to stand, but she put a hand on his arm, stopping him. Smart. Any objection now would look like an admission of guilt. Janie Wells stood up from her seat near the middle. "Can you tell us about the financial stuff? The money the HOA's been spending?" Ethan moved to the second poster board, which displayed a simplified breakdown of the HOA's suspicious expenditures over the past 5 years. The board has been paying thousands of dollars to consulting companies that never provided any services, tree removal services that never removed any trees, legal advice that could have been found in any law textbook. "That's a serious accusation," Patricia said, her voice dangerously calm. "It's a serious crime," Ethan replied. "Embezzlement, fraud, theft from the community fund. The room erupted in angry voices. People shouted questions, demanded explanations, shared stories of unfair fines and arbitrary enforcement. Patricia's carefully maintained order was dissolving into chaos, and for the first time since he'd moved to Rosewood Acres, Ethan saw genuine fear flicker across her face. "Order!" Patricia shouted, banging a gavel she'd brought from her purse. "This meeting is not official HOA business, and these accusations are unsubstantiated." "The accusations are documented," Bill Turner said, stepping forward from the back of the room. 20 years of records, bank statements, invoices, board meeting minutes that show exactly how the money disappeared. Patricia's composure cracked completely. "Mr. Turner, you were terminated from HOA employment for cause. Your accusations are those of a disgruntled ex-employee with a personal vendetta." "My accusations are backed up by evidence that shows you've been stealing from these people for years." The room fell silent again, the weight of the accusations settling over the crowd like a heavy blanket. Patricia looked around at faces that had once shown her deference and respect, now filled with suspicion and anger. "This is ridiculous," she said, but her voice lacked its usual authority. "Mr. Carter, if you have evidence of wrongdoing, take it to the proper authorities. Don't drag our neighbors into some personal crusade based on conspiracy theories and forged documents." "The documents aren't forged," Ray Thompson said, standing slowly. "And this isn't personal. It's about 20 years of watching good people driven out of their homes by fines they couldn't afford. It's about watching this community turn into a prison where nobody dares to plant a flower or hang a bird feeder without permission." Other voices joined in. Linda Hargrove talked about the 27 violations they'd received in 3 months. Sam described watching neighbors move away rather than fight impossible fines. Jamie spoke for the younger residents who'd grown up watching their parents live in fear. Patricia tried to regain control, calling for order, demanding that people follow proper procedures, but the dam had burst. Story after story poured out. Families bankrupted by legal fees, elderly residents terrorized by constant inspections, children forbidden from playing in their own yards. "Enough!" Patricia finally shouted, her professional mask completely gone. "This is nothing but a mob of complainers, led by a man who's been here for 3 weeks and thinks he can tear down everything we've built. Mr. Carter, you have no idea what you're unleashing. These rules exist for a reason. Without order, without standards, this neighborhood will become a slum." "Without your rules," Ethan said quietly, "this neighborhood might become a community again." The silence that followed was electric. Patricia looked around the room one more time, seeing faces that would never look at her the same way again, then gathered her lawyers and walked toward the door. "This isn't over," she said, stopping beside Ethan's table. "You have no idea what you've started, or what it's going to cost you." As the door closed behind her, the room exploded in conversation. People clustered around Ethan's evidence displays, asking questions, sharing their own stories, making plans. For the first time in years, Rosewood Acres felt alive with possibility instead of fear. Emma appeared at his elbow, grinning. "Dad, did you see her face when Ray stood up? I thought she was going to have a stroke." "This is just the beginning," Ethan said, watching his neighbors transform from isolated individuals into something that looked like a real community. "The hard part starts tomorrow." But tonight, for the first time since Sarah's death, Ethan felt like he was fighting for something bigger than just survival. He was fighting for the idea that ordinary people could stand up to bullies and win, that communities could be more than just collections of houses with matching mailboxes. Tonight, he was fighting for home. The lawsuit arrived by certified mail on a Tuesday morning, thick with legal language and threats that made Ethan's coffee taste like ash. Patricia wasn't wasting time with subtle intimidation anymore. She was bringing out the heavy artillery. Cease and desist, defamation, harassment, and interference with lawful business operations. The document accused Ethan of spreading false information, damaging the HOA's reputation, and interfering with their legal authority to govern the community. It demanded he retract all statements made at the town hall meeting, return all HOA documents in his possession, and pay damages for, quote, harm caused to the organization's standing in the community. Emma read over his shoulder, her breath warm against his neck. Can they do this? They can try. Ethan set the papers down with hands that weren't quite steady. The question is whether they can make it stick. His phone had been ringing all morning, neighbors calling to ask if the lawsuit affected them, if they should be worried about speaking out, if maybe they should just keep their heads down and let things go back to normal. The fear was spreading like a virus, and Patricia knew it. The second wave of attack came that afternoon. Violation notices appeared on doorsteps throughout the neighborhood, not just for Ethan, but for everyone who'd spoken at the town hall meeting. Ray Thompson got cited for unauthorized garden modifications. Linda Hargrove was fined for having her newspaper delivered to the wrong side of her driveway. Janie Wells' grandmother received a notice about excessive noise complaints that were obviously fabricated. "She's trying to divide us," Emma said as they tallied up the new fines. "Make people think that supporting you will just bring more trouble." Ethan nodded grimly. It was a smart strategy. Patricia couldn't attack the evidence directly. Too much of it was bulletproof. But she could make life miserable for anyone who stood with him. Fear was a powerful weapon, and she was wielding it with surgical precision. The third attack came from an unexpected direction. Emma's school called that evening to inform them that her enrollment was being reviewed due to questions about their residency status. Apparently, someone had filed a complaint suggesting that the Carters weren't legitimate residents of Rosewood Acres. "She's going after Emma now," Ethan said to Bill Turner as they sat in the old man's garage, surrounded by evidence boxes and empty coffee cups. "Going after my daughter." "Patricia's scared," Bill said. "Desperate people do desperate things." "Scared or not, she's winning. Half the people who supported us at the town hall are backing away. Can't blame them. Who wants to risk their kids' education or their family's financial security for a fight that might not even work?" Bill was quiet for a long moment, studying Ethan's face in the harsh fluorescent light. "You thinking about giving up?" "I'm thinking about protecting my daughter." "And how's running away going to protect her? You think Patricia's going to leave you alone if you surrender? You think she's going to forgive and forget?" Ethan knew the answer, but hearing it out loud still hit like a punch to the gut. Patricia had made this personal. Even if he backed down now, she'd find ways to make his life miserable for as long as he lived in Rosewood Acres. The only way out was through. "What do we need to win this?" he asked. "Proof that holds up in court, witnesses willing to testify, and a lawyer who isn't afraid of Patricia's connections." "The lawyer's going to be expensive." "Maybe. Or maybe we get creative." The creative solution came from an unexpected source. Emma had been researching legal aid organizations online, looking for attorneys who specialized in HOA disputes. What she found was something better. A law professor at the state university who'd written extensively about homeowner association abuse and was looking for a high-profile case to use as a teaching tool. Professor Janet Martinez was in her 50s, with graying hair and the intense focus of someone who'd spent years fighting institutional corruption. She drove out to Rosewood Acres on a Saturday morning, spent 3 hours reviewing their evidence, and pronounced it the most comprehensive documentation of HOA fraud I've ever seen. "You understand this is going to be a war," she warned them. "Patricia has money, connections, and nothing left to lose. She's going to throw everything at you." "Can we win?" Emma asked. "With evidence like this, absolutely. But winning in court isn't the same as winning in life. Even if we destroy Patricia's legal authority, even if we get her prosecuted for fraud, she's going to try to destroy you first. She's already trying." Professor Martinez smiled grimly. "Then we better move fast." The counterattack began immediately. Instead of responding to Patricia's lawsuit defensively, they went on the offensive. Martinez filed a federal complaint alleging systematic civil rights violations, fraud, and racketeering under the RICO Act. The complaint named not just Patricia, but the entire HOA board and several of the consulting companies that had been receiving fraudulent payments. The legal filing made the local news. "Suburban HOA accused of systematic fraud" ran as the headline in the Metro section of the newspaper, complete with interviews with Ethan and several neighbors who'd been victimized by Patricia's system. Patricia's response was swift and vicious. She called an emergency HOA board meeting and passed a resolution banning Ethan from all common areas, including the streets and sidewalks. She filed a restraining order, claiming he'd made threatening statements. She even tried to have his utilities shut off, claiming the meters were on HOA property. But something had changed in the neighborhood. The publicity had emboldened people who'd been afraid to speak out. Stories started appearing on social media, residents sharing their own experiences with HOA abuse, posting pictures of ridiculous violation notices, documenting years of systematic intimidation. Ray Thompson planted a flower garden directly in front of his house, in full view of the street. Linda Hargrove hung wind chimes from her front porch. Janie Wells organized a group of teenagers to play basketball in the common area park, deliberately violating the, quote, "no recreational activities without permits" rule. "It's beautiful," Emma said as they watched their neighbors reclaim their community. "People are finally fighting back." But Patricia wasn't finished. Her final gambit was the most personal yet. She filed a complaint with Child Protective Services, claiming that Ethan was an unfit parent who was endangering Emma by involving her in, quote, "dangerous criminal activities." The CPS investigator was a tired-looking woman in her 40s who clearly had better things to do than chase down frivolous complaints. She spent 20 minutes interviewing Emma, another 20 reviewing the family's living situation, and left with barely concealed disgust for whoever had wasted her time. But the message was clear. Patricia would stop at nothing to destroy anyone who threatened her power. "There's more," Bill said, pulling out a thick folder labeled "Legal Threats Resolved." Inside were copies of correspondence between Patricia and various attorneys, along with settlement agreements that had forced residents to pay thousands in fines and legal fees for violations they'd tried to fight. "The Kowalskis weren't the only ones," Emma said, flipping through the documents. "Look at this. The Martinez family paid $6,000 to settle a dispute over a fence that was supposedly 3 inches too high. The Chen family paid $4,000 for having the wrong color shutters. And here's the really sick part," Bill said, pointing to a notation in Patricia's handwriting. "She deliberately escalates minor violations into major legal disputes, then offers to settle for amounts that are just low enough that people think they're getting a deal." Ethan felt a cold rage building in his chest. This wasn't just about rules and regulations. Patricia had turned the HOA into a weapon, using it to systematically terrorize and exploit the people who were supposed to be her neighbors. "How did you get all this?" he asked. 20 years of working for the HOA gives you access to a lot of records. Plus, people talk to the groundskeeper. They figure you're invisible, just part of the landscape. You'd be amazed what people will say when they think nobody's listening. "And Patricia never suspected you were keeping copies?" Bill's smile was sharp and satisfied. "Patricia's smart, but she's arrogant. She thinks she's the smartest person in every room, which makes her blind to threats she doesn't expect. Figured the dumb groundskeeper wasn't worth worrying about." They worked until dark, documenting years of financial fraud, legal intimidation, and systematic abuse of authority. By the time they were finished, Emma's phone was full of photographs, and Ethan's head was spinning with the magnitude of what they'd uncovered. "This is enough to destroy her," Emma said as they packed up the evidence. "Financial fraud, extortion, harassment. She could go to prison for this." "Only if we can prove it in court," Ethan said, "and only if people are willing to come forward as witnesses." "They will be," Bill said confidently. "Once they see what she's really been doing, once they understand they're not alone, they'll find their courage." As they prepared to leave, Bill grabbed Ethan's arm. "Son, I need you to understand something. What we found tonight, this is just the tip of the iceberg. Patricia's been building this system for years, and she's got allies we don't even know about. Board members, contractors, even some city officials who've been looking the other way in exchange for campaign contributions." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying this fight is bigger than just the HOA. You're threatening a whole network of people who've been profiting from this arrangement. They're not going to go down without a fight." Ethan looked at the boxes of evidence, then at Emma's determined face, and felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a lead blanket. They'd found the ammunition they needed to bring down Patricia's empire, but now they had to figure out how to use it without getting crushed in the process. "Bill," he said finally, "do you really think we can win this?" The old man was quiet for a long moment, studying Ethan's face in the dim garage light. "I think you're about to find out what you're really made of," he said. "And I think Patricia Langston is about to learn that some people don't stay down when you try to step on them." As they walked home through the quiet streets, Ethan felt like he was seeing Rosewood Acres for the first time. Behind every perfect lawn and pristine mailbox was a family that had been systematically exploited and intimidated. Behind every drawn curtain was someone who'd learned to live in fear of their own neighbors. But fear was a two-way street. And tomorrow, Patricia Langston was going to learn what it felt like to be afraid. The community center had never seen a crowd like this. Every folding chair was occupied, with more residents standing along the walls and clustering near the doors. The air buzzed with nervous energy and whispered conversations that stopped abruptly whenever someone new entered the room. That night, as Ethan tucked Emma into bed, she looked up at him with Sarah's fierce determination burning in her eyes. "Dad, are we really going to win this?" "I don't know, sweetheart. I hope so." "Even if we don't," she said quietly, "I'm proud of you for trying. Mom would be proud too." As he turned off her light and headed to his own room, Ethan felt the weight of responsibilities settling on his shoulders like armor. Tomorrow would bring new attacks, new threats, new attempts to break his resolve. But tonight, his daughter was proud of him. Tonight, his neighbors were standing up instead of backing down. Tonight, Rosewood Acres felt like a community worth fighting for. Patricia Langston was about to learn that some people couldn't be intimidated, some fights were worth having, and some communities were stronger than the bullies who tried to control them. The morning Patricia Langston's resignation letter appeared on every doorstep in Rosewood Acres, the neighborhood felt different. The air seemed lighter somehow, as if a storm front had finally passed through and left clear skies in its wake. Emma found the letter first, tucked under their welcome mat like a white flag of surrender. The language was formal and cold, citing health concerns and a desire to, quote, spend more time with family. But the real message was simpler. Patricia was running before she could be pushed. "She's gone," Emma said, bursting into the kitchen where Ethan was making coffee. Patricia resigned from the HOA board, effective immediately. Ethan read the letter twice, looking for hidden traps or last-minute attacks, but there were none. Professor Martinez's legal assault had been thorough and devastating. Patricia's consulting companies were under federal investigation. 3 board members had already been arrested for fraud. The woman who'd terrorized Rosewood Acres for 8 years was retreating to fight smaller battles on easier terrain. "Does this mean we won?" Emma asked. "It means Patricia's done, but winning isn't just about defeating her. It's about what we build next." The first community meeting in the post-Patricia era was held that Saturday afternoon in the park, the same park Patricia had tried to ban Ethan from accessing. Folding chairs appeared from houses throughout the neighborhood, along with card tables laden with homemade cookies and thermoses of coffee. Children ran between the trees while their parents talked about the future. Ray Thompson had volunteered to serve as temporary board chair, his quiet dignity earning immediate respect from residents who'd grown tired of authoritarian leadership. He called the meeting to order with the gentle tap of a carpenter's hammer against a tree trunk. "First order of business," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the gathered crowd, "is figuring out how we want to govern ourselves going forward." The discussion that followed was everything a community meeting should be: passionate but respectful, focused on solutions rather than blame. Linda Hargrove proposed a new board structure with term limits and regular elections. Bill Turner suggested transparent budgets posted monthly on a community website. Jenny Wells advocated for youth representation and family-friendly policies. "What about the rules?" someone called from the back. "Do we just throw out all the covenants?" "We keep what makes sense," Ethan said, standing to address the group. "Basic maintenance standards, noise ordinances, things that protect everyone's quality of life. But we get rid of the petty restrictions, the arbitrary fines, the rules that exist, just to give someone power over their neighbors." The transformation didn't happen overnight, but it was visible almost immediately. Wind chimes appeared on porches. Children's bikes materialized in driveways. Gardens bloomed with personality instead of conformity. Wildflowers mixed with vegetables. Decorative fences painted in colors that made people smile. Mrs. Chen hung prayer flags in her backyard. The Kowalski family installed the swing set they'd been dreaming about for 5 years. Ray's vegetable garden expanded to include a small greenhouse that would have given Patricia an aneurysm but made the whole neighborhood smell like tomatoes and fresh herbs. The financial cleanup took longer, but the results were encouraging. Professor Martinez's legal team had recovered nearly $200,000 in fraudulent expenditures, money that went back into a community fund dedicated to actual improvements rather than Patricia's personal accounts. New playground equipment appeared in the park. The retention pond got a walking path and benches where elderly residents could sit and watch the sunset. Emma threw herself into the youth organizing efforts with the enthusiasm of someone finally allowed to have opinions about her own life. She started a neighborhood newsletter, organized movie nights in the park, and convinced the new board to create a community garden where families could grow their own food. "It's like watching the neighborhood come alive," she told Ethan one evening as they walked the streets that had once felt like prison corridors but now buzzed with conversation and laughter. The changes weren't just cosmetic. Property values actually increased as word spread about Rosewood Acres, transformation from HOA nightmare to genuine community. Young families moved in, drawn by the promise of reasonable rules and neighborly cooperation. Elderly residents who'd been thinking about leaving decided to stay and enjoy their golden years in a place that felt like home again. Not everything was perfect. There were still disputes about noise levels and property boundaries. Still disagreements about community priorities and budget allocations. But now those conflicts were handled through conversation and compromise, rather than fines and legal threats. 6 months after Patricia's resignation, the Rosewood Acres Community Association, they dropped homeowners from the name, held its first annual election. Ray Thompson was unanimously re-elected as board chair. Linda Hargrove became treasurer, bringing her accounting background to bear on transparent financial management. Bill Turner accepted the newly created position of community ombudsman, someone residents could approach with concerns without fear of retaliation. Ethan was elected to the board as well, though he'd initially resisted the nomination. "I never wanted to be a politician," he told Emma. "I just wanted to live in peace." "Sometimes living in peace means making sure other people can live in peace too," she replied. The first board meeting under the new system was held in Ray's living room, with coffee and homemade cookies and discussions that focused on solving problems rather than creating them. They approved a new playground design, allocated funds for street repairs, and established a community scholarship fund for local high school graduates. As Ethan walked home from that meeting, he reflected on how much had changed since that first morning when he'd found Patricia's violation notice on his windshield. The same streets that had once felt oppressive now hummed with life and possibility. The same neighbors who'd once hidden behind drawn curtains now waved from their porches and stopped to chat about their gardens. Emma was waiting for him on their front porch, curled up with a book and a cup of hot chocolate. The porch light cast a warm glow that spilled onto the sidewalk, welcoming instead of warning. "How did the meeting go?" she asked. "Good, really good." He settled into the chair beside her, feeling the satisfaction of work well done and battles fairly won. "You know what the best part is?" "What?" "It was boring. Wonderfully, beautifully boring. No drama, no threats, no one trying to intimidate anyone else. Just neighbors figuring out how to take care of their community." Emma smiled and leaned against his shoulder. "Mom would have loved this, seeing the neighborhood come together, watching people stand up for each other. She would have been proud of you too. The way you helped organize everything, the way you brought people together. I learned from the best." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the lights come on in houses throughout Rosewood Acres. Each window represented a family that was no longer afraid of their own neighbors, no longer living under the thumb of someone who confused power with authority. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new decisions to make, new problems to solve. But tonight, Rosewood Acres was what every neighborhood should be, a place where people could live in peace, raise their children in safety, and trust that their neighbors would stand with them when times got tough. Tonight, they were home. 1 year later, Ethan Carter stood in his backyard watching Emma and Janie Wells hang streamers from the oak tree that had been there when they'd first arrived but somehow looked taller now, stronger, like it had been waiting all this time for someone to notice its potential for celebration. The first annual Rosewood Acres Community Festival was Emma's idea, though it had quickly grown beyond anything she'd originally imagined. What started as a simple block party had evolved into a neighborhood-wide celebration that drew visitors from surrounding communities who'd heard about their transformation and wanted to see what genuine democracy looked like at the grassroots level. "Dad, can you help us with this banner?" Emma called from beneath the tree, wrestling with a length of fabric that proclaimed "Welcome Home" in letters painted by children from throughout the neighborhood. Ethan climbed to the stepladder they'd borrowed from Ray Thompson, securing one end of the banner while Emma and Janie held the other. From this vantage point, he could see the entire sweep of Rosewood Acres spread out like a living map of everything they'd built together. The Hargrove house sported a front garden that would have given Patricia Langston nightmares, a riot of wildflowers and vegetables that attracted butterflies and neighborhood cats in equal measure. The Chen family's prayer flags fluttered in the afternoon breeze, their bright colors a celebration of diversity that the old regime would never have tolerated. 3 houses down, the Martinez family was setting up a taco stand for the festival, their teenage son grilling corn with the focused intensity of someone who took community events seriously. "Remember when this place felt like a prison?" Emma said as they climbed down from the ladder. "I remember when we thought moving here was a mistake," Ethan replied, adjusting the banner so it hung evenly between the tree branches. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we'd just given up, paid the fines, followed all of Patricia's rules, kept our heads down like everyone else?" Ethan considered the question as he folded the stepladder. It was something he'd thought about often during the darkest moments of their fight. What if he'd chosen safety over justice, compliance over resistance? What if he decided that protecting Emma meant avoiding conflict rather than standing up for what was right? "I think we would have survived," he said finally, "but I don't think we would have lived." The festival officially began at noon, though people had been arriving since 10 a.m. with folding chairs and coolers and the kind of excited energy that comes from being part of something bigger than yourself. Ray Thompson manned the grilling station with military precision, flipping burgers and hot dogs while holding court about the neighborhood's transformation. Bill Turner had set up a display of before and after photos showing the community's evolution from sterile conformity to vibrant diversity. Linda Hargrove organized the children's activities with the efficiency of someone who'd found her calling in community service. She'd created a scavenger hunt that sent kids throughout the neighborhood, looking for specific flowers, architectural details, and painted decorations that would have been violations under the old system, but were now badges of creative freedom. "This is amazing," Professor Martinez said, appearing at Ethan's elbow with a plate of Ray's famous potato salad. "I've never seen a community bounce back so completely from systematic abuse." "It wasn't bouncing back," Ethan said, watching a group of elderly residents teach neighborhood children how to play bocce ball on the community center lawn. "It was discovering what we'd always had the potential to become." The professor followed his gaze, taking in the scene of intergenerational cooperation and genuine enjoyment. "You know, I've been documenting your case for my research. The transformation here is going to be studied for decades as an example of how communities can reclaim democratic governance from authoritarian control. Will that help other neighborhoods dealing with similar problems?" "Already is. I've gotten calls from 3 different communities asking for help with their own HOA disputes." Apparently, Patricia's methods weren't unique. As the afternoon wore on, Ethan found himself drifting from conversation to conversation, marveling at how naturally the community had organized itself around principles of cooperation rather than control. The teenagers had created their own entertainment area in the park, complete with music and impromptu dance competitions that nobody tried to shut down for noise violations. The elderly residents had claimed the shaded picnic tables near the retention pond, sharing stories and homemade desserts with the relaxed pleasure of people who finally felt at home in their own neighborhood. Emma appeared beside him as the sun began to sink toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that reflected perfectly in the retention pond's still surface. "Janie and I were talking," she said, "about college applications and stuff." Ethan felt a familiar pang at the reminder that Emma would be leaving for university in another year. The time had passed so quickly, their focus so completely absorbed by the community's transformation, that he'd almost forgotten his daughter was growing up. "Any thoughts on where you want to apply?" "Actually, yes. Professor Martinez mentioned that the state university has a really good program in community organizing and public policy. She said she'd be willing to supervise an independent study project about what happened here." The idea of Emma studying their experience academically struck Ethan as both surreal and perfectly appropriate. She'd been more than just a witness to Rosewood Acres' transformation. She'd been one of its architects, helping to build bridges between different age groups and creating the kinds of inclusive programs that made democracy actually work. "You want to become a professional community organizer?" "I want to help places like this," she said simply. "I want to help people figure out that they don't have to accept being pushed around by bullies with clipboards and legal threats." As evening settled over the festival, someone produced a guitar, and impromptu music began flowing from the area near the community center. Children chased fireflies while their parents lingered over conversations that had started hours earlier and showed no signs of ending. The festival was supposed to wrap up at sunset, but nobody seemed inclined to leave. Ethan found himself sitting on a blanket with Ray and Bill, watching Emma lead a group of teenagers in what appeared to be an elaborate game involving lawn chairs and a frisbee. The rules were incomprehensible to anyone over 20, but the laughter was universal. "You ever regret it?" Ray asked quietly. "Taking on Patricia? Starting this whole fight?" "Never," Ethan said without hesitation. "Even when I was scared we'd lose everything, even when she was threatening Emma's school enrollment, I never regretted standing up to her." "Why not?" Ethan thought about Sarah, about the conversations they'd had during her final weeks, about the kind of world they wanted to leave for their daughter, about the importance of fighting for principles even when the fight seemed impossible to win. "Because some things are worth the risk," he said. "Community is worth the risk. Democracy is worth the risk. Teaching your children that they don't have to accept injustice is worth the risk." Bill raised his beer bottle in a mock toast. "To worth the risk." "To worth the risk," Ray agreed. As the three men sat in comfortable silence, watching their neighbors enjoy the kind of evening that had once seemed impossible in Rosewood Acres, Ethan felt a deep sense of completion. Not because their work was finished. Democracy was an ongoing project that required constant attention and care, but because they'd proven something important to themselves and their community. They'd proven that ordinary people could stand up to institutional corruption and win. They'd proven that neighborhoods could be more than just collections of houses with matching mailboxes. They'd proven that community wasn't something that happened to you. It was something you built, together, one conversation and one small act of courage at a time. The last guests didn't leave until well past 10 p.m., and the cleanup took another hour of collaborative effort that somehow felt more like a continuation of the party than actual work. As Ethan and Emma finally walked home through streets still glowing with the warmth of shared celebration, Emma slipped her arm through his. "Dad?" "Yeah. Thanks for fighting. Thanks for not giving up when things got scary." "Thanks for fighting with me," he replied. "I couldn't have done any of this without you." They walked the rest of the way home in comfortable silence, past houses where lights still glowed in windows and the sound of quiet conversation drifted from porches where neighbors had lingered to extend the evening just a little longer. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new decisions to make, new problems to solve. But tonight, Rosewood Acres was exactly what every community should aspire to be. A place where people could live in peace, raise their children in safety, and trust that their neighbors would stand with them when standing up was required. Tonight, they were home, and home was worth everything they'd risked to find it. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.